For the upcoming release of Avengers Infinity War, I decided myself that I wanted to review all the MCU movies before the release date of Infinity War, which is April 27th of this year. Now I know most people are reviewing at least one Marvel movie a week. However, since the movie is right around the corner, I decided to review at least a few movies at a time before Infinity War comes out. So for this entire video, I'll be reviewing the first 3 movies of Phase 1 in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So the first movie we'll be reviewing is Iron Man, which is Marvel's first MCU movie. In Iron Man, Tony Stark is a genius, billionaire, playboy philanthropist. He conducts weapons and tests them overseas. However, terrorists kidnapped him and forced him to build a devastating weapon. Instead, he builds an armored suit and escapes. Returning to America, Stark refines the suit and uses it to combat crime and terrorism. I think this movie is really good and is one of the best MCU movies by far. The pros have to be that the action is awesome, it has great characters, Robert Downey Jr. does a great job as Tony Stark, and the effects. Man, I gotta love those effects. I think what I love most about this movie is that it uses a lot of practical effects. Instead of using a lot of CGI, which most MCU movies really do nowadays, I loved how the effects looked in this movie, especially for Iron Man's armor. I gotta admit that I thought all the suits were real in this movie. There really isn't that many cons to this movie. The only con I have to say is the love interest between Tony Stark and Pepper Potts. To me, it seems awkward and a bit annoying, especially seeing Pepper's character. I really don't like her personality at all in this movie or in the other movies, but I have to admit, I do like her in this movie the most compared to the other ones. Now, I loved Ironmonger. He's gotta be one of the most underrated villains of the MCU. Now, I do have to admit that his motivation for becoming Ironmonger is a bit forward. I mean, he's jealous of Tony because he wants to run the company, but that turns him into a murderous villain? That just doesn't make sense. I mean, it shows how greedy he is for becoming powerful. Other than that, I really don't have any complaints for this movie. It's really well done, and it's a great start for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now we're on to our second movie of the MCU, which is The Incredible Hulk. Scientist Bruce Banner desperately seeks a cure for the gamma radiation that is contaminated in his cells and turns him into the Hulk. Cut off from his true love Betty Ross and forced to hide from his nemesis General Thunderbolt Ross, Banner soon comes face to face with a new threat, a supremely powerful enemy known as the Abomination. To be honest, I find this movie very enjoyable. It's entertaining, especially with the Hulk scenes. My favorite scenes would have to be the fight in the military scene during the park and the ending scene with Abomination. You gotta admit, that was pretty cool. Now, while this movie does have its pros, it definitely has its cons. The cons would have to be as the plot is very bland. I mean, Bruce Banner wanting to get rid of his powers is a good plot, except the fact that, for a majority of the time in the beginning of the movie, he's on his computer talking to Mr. Blue. I didn't mind seeing Bruce or Betty together at all. I thought they were a good couple, and I think they worked well on screen together. Thunderbolt Ross, he was an okay character. I mean, he's just a typical asshole that just gives orders and is just trying to give down the Hulk. The Abomination, I didn't really care for the actor too much that played him, though when he becomes Abomination, that's when the movie really gets interesting. I think the movie works best with the Incredible Hulk on screen. That's when it gets interesting, because without the Hulk, the pacing of this movie is very slow and sometimes boring. If Marvel Studios took over instead of Universal, I think this movie would have been a lot better. Now, I do believe that this is the weakest, or at least one of the weakest in the MCU. Now, is this movie bad? No, not at all. But it could be better. But overall, I thought this movie was enjoyable, and while it does have its pros and cons, it is still fun to watch. And now on to the third entry of the MCU, which is Iron Man 2. With the world now aware that he's Iron Man, billion inventor Tony Stark faces pressure from all sides to share his technology with the military. He refuses, fearing the information will fall into the wrong hands. With Pepper Potts and Rhodes by his side, Tony must forge new allies and confront a powerful new enemy called Whiplash. Now, I have to admit that this movie is freaking sick. When I went to go watch it in theaters, I was blown away by the action sequences. It was really cool to see Tony Stark and his new suits in the movie. I really liked the Mark V. That had to be my most favorite. The character development was pretty well. The characters interacted with each other. Jon Favreau does a good job directing the movie. And I think overall it is pretty entertaining. I really enjoyed Black Widow in this movie. I felt like this was a great way to introduce her character. I also loved War Machine's replacement, Don Cheadle. I feel like he interacts with Tony really well in this movie. Whiplash is a cool villain, but we don't really get to see him that much in this movie. Instead, we see the terrible Justin Hammer. I didn't really care for him at all because his motivation is just he's jealous of Tony Stark, just like Obadiah Stane was in the first movie, and he wants to build his own suits. Some elements in this movie are similar to that of the first movie, just like I said with Justin Hammer. Also, Tony Stark needs to build something in this movie in order for him to survive because his arc reactor is failing. Also, I heard that the producers wanted to make this more of a setup to the Avengers rather than a standalone Iron Man film. Now, I think that the first movie worked really well was because it was a standalone Iron Man movie, and the only Easter egg we had was at the end when Nick Fury shows up and calls for the Avengers Initiative, which I gotta admit is a pretty good Easter egg, just that one scene. And in this movie, they add a ton of Easter eggs. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but they didn't really need to do that. Like I said before, if this was more of a standalone Iron Man film, then this movie would have been just as good as the first one. Well, that's the first 3 MCU movies. Leave a like, comment, and subscribe below, and I'll see you guys next time.